For ages, man in the West has believed that Rome and Greece had provided him with civilization. On the other hand, Greek philosophers have declared on multiple occasions that they drew on even earlier sources. Travelers returning to Europe from Egypt described seeing imposing pyramids, temple cities half buried in sand dunes guarded by bizarre stone monsters. Thus it was that when Napoleon landed in Egypt in 1799, he brought a team of experts with him to study and interpret the monuments. One of his officers discovered a stone slab near Rosetta with an inscription dating from 196 BCE, written in hieroglyphic, Old Egyptian pictographic writing, and 2 additional scripts. The discovery of ancient Egyptian script and language, as well as later archaeological investigation, demonstrated to Western man that Egypt had a sophisticated civilization long before Greek culture arrived. Egyptian archives date royal dynasties back to 3100 BCE, more than 2 millennia before the Hellenic civilization. Greece was a latecomer rather than a pioneer, maturing in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. So was Egypt the cradle of our civilization? Regardless of how logical that conclusion sounded, the facts worked against it, despite the fact that Greek scholars documented visits to Egypt. The ancient knowledge sources they mentioned were unearthed elsewhere. The pre-Hellenic cultures of the Aegean Sea, the Minoan on Crete's island and the Mycenaean on the Greek mainland, showed traces of Near Eastern culture adoption rather than Egyptian culture adoption. Key routes for the Greeks to get access to the earlier civilization were Syria and Anatolia, not Egypt. Scholars have been ecstatic to discover a rising number of parallels between Semitic and Hellenic civilizations, noting that the Dorian conquest of Greece and the Israelite invasion of Canaan following the Exodus from Egypt both took place about the same period, around the 13th century BCE. By establishing that Linear A, an early Minoan script, reflected a Semitic language, Professor Cyrus H. Gordon pioneered a new field of research. He believed that the pattern, as opposed to the content, of Hebrew and Minoan civilizations is startlingly comparable, and the island's name, Crete, was the same as the Hebrew word Keret, the walled city, and had a Semitic counterpart in the story about a king of Keret. The Near East gave birth to the Hellenistic alphabet, which gave rise to Latin and English alphabets. According to ancient Greek historians, the alphabet was given to them by a Phoenician named Cadmus, which means old, who had the same number of letters in the same order as in the Hebrew alphabet. It was the only Greek alphabet during the time of the Trojan War. The poet Simonides of Ceos raised the number of letters to the 26th that we know, sometime in the 5th century BCE. When comparing the sequence, names, signs, and even numerical values of the original Near Eastern alphabet with those of the far later ancient Greek and more modern Latin, it is apparent that Greek and Latin writing, as well as the entire foundation of our Western culture, came from the Near East. Greek ties to the Near East in the first millennia BCE are well known to scholars, culminating in Alexander the Macedonian's conquest of the Persians in 331 BCE. Many details concerning these Persians and their homelands, roughly paralleling today's Iran, were recorded in Greek records. Scholars concluded they were part of the Aryan or lordly people who appeared from somewhere near the Caspian Sea toward the end of the 2nd millennium BCE, based mostly on the names of their kings, Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, and the names of their deities, which appear to belong in the Indo-European linguistic stem. It's also reached westward to Asia Minor, eastward to India, and southerly to the countries of the Medes and Parsis mentioned in the Old Testament. If you're interested in information on the ancient Aryan race, please check out our series on Arctic Home in the Vedas, which we have linked in the description. It wasn't all that simple. Despite their alleged foreign origins, the invaders were treated as if they were actual figures in the Old Testament. Cyrus, for example, was referred to as anointed of Yahweh, indicating a remarkable link between non-Hebrew and the Hebrew God. According to the ancient book of Ezra, Cyrus confessed his intention to restore the temple in Jerusalem and stated that he was acting on directions from Yahweh, whom he referred to as God of Heaven, after the name given to the dynasty by its founder, Hachemanish. Cyrus and the successive monarchs of his dynasty were known as Achaemenids. This is not an Aryan title, but a magnificent Semitic appellation meaning wise man. Scholars have mainly dismissed various signs pointing to parallels between the Hebrew god Yahweh and the god Achaemenians dubbed the Wise Lord, who was shown on Darius' royal seal as soaring in the skies within a winged globe. The old Persians' cultural, spiritual, and historical roots have already been established, stretching back to the ancient empires of Babylon and Assyria, whose size and fall were recorded in the Old Testament. The symbols that made up the script found on Achaemenid monuments and seals were originally regarded to be lovely ornaments. Engelbert Kampfer, who visited Persepolis, the old Persian capital, in 1686, identified the marks as cunates, or wedge-shaped impressions. That script has now been referred to as cuneiform. As the Achaemenid inscriptions were deciphered, it became evident that they were inscribed in the same script as the inscriptions found on ancient artifacts and tablets in Mesopotamia, the plains and highlands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In 1843, Paul-Émile Botta, intrigued by the dispersed artifacts, set out to conduct the first significant deliberate excavation. He chose a location near Mosul, presently known as Khorsabad, in northern Mesopotamia. Botta was able to determine the site was named Dur Sharukin in cuneiform writings. The name meant walled city of the righteous king, according to Semitic inscriptions, which were written in the sister language to Hebrew. This ruler is referred to as Sargon II in our textbooks. This Assyrian king's capital had a magnificent royal palace with walls lined in sculptured bas-reliefs that would run for nearly a mile if laid end to end. The city and the royal compound were guarded by a ziggurat, a step pyramid that served as a stairway to heaven for the gods. The city's layout and sculptures reflected a grandiose way of life. In just 5 years, the palaces, temples, residences, stables, warehouses, walls, gates, columns, decorations, statues, artworks, towers, ramparts, terraces, and gardens were all built. The mind reels before the potential strength of the empire that could do so much in such a short space 3,000 years ago, writes Georges Conteneu in his book Babylon and Assyria. Not to be outdone by the French, the English arrived in the form of Sir Austen Henry Layard, who chose a location 10 miles downstream from Khorsabad on the Tigris River. Kunujik was the local name, and it turned out to be the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. Biblical names and events were beginning to take shape. Under Assyria's last 3 major rulers, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal, Nineveh was the royal capital. Now, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the walled cities of Judah, relates the Old Testament in 2 Kings 18:13. When the angel of the Lord smote his army, Sennacherib departed and went back and dwelt in Nineveh. Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal built palaces, temples, and works of art that rivaled those of Sargon on the mounds where Nineveh was built. The site of Esarhaddon's palaces cannot be explored since it is currently the site of a Muslim mosque built over the purported burial place of the prophet Jonah, who was swallowed by a whale after refusing to deliver Yahweh's word to Nineveh. According to ancient Greek texts, a commander in Alexander's army witnessed the site of pyramids and remains of an old city. metropolis that had already been buried by the time of Alexander. It was also discovered by Layard, and it turned out to be Nimrud, Assyria's military capital. Shalmaneser II erected an obelisk there to commemorate his military achievements and voyages. The obelisk, which is now on display in the British Museum, identifies Jehu, son of Omri, king of Israel, as one of the monarchs who were forced to pay tribute. The Mesopotamian inscriptions and biblical passages back each other up once more. Assyriologists, as these researchers have come to be known, were astounded by the increased frequency with which archaeological finds corroborated biblical narratives. They looked to the 10th chapter of Genesis. Nimrod was depicted as a builder of all the Mesopotamian kingdoms, as a mighty hunter by Yahweh's grace. And in the beginning of his kingdom, Babel and Erech and Akkad, all in the land of Shinar, out of that land there emanated Ashur, where Nineveh was built, a city of wide streets, and Calah and Rezin, the great city which is between Nineveh and Calah. From 1903 to 1914, teams led by W. André excavated the site, uncovering the ruins of Ashur, the Assyrian sacred center and first capital. Only Resen, of all the Assyrian cities listed in the Bible, has been discovered thus far. Its name means the horse's bridle, and therefore it could have been the site of Assyria's royal stables. If you find this fascinating, please hit the like button. If you're not already, go ahead and subscribe. Click the bell so you'll be notified whenever we put out more great videos like this one. Around the same time as Ashur was being excavated, crews led by R. Koldewey were finishing up the excavation of Babylon, the biblical Babel, a massive city with palaces, temples, hanging gardens, and the requisite ziggurat. Artifacts and inscriptions soon revealed the history of Mesopotamia's two rival empires, Babylonia and Assyria, one in the south, the other in the north. Rising and collapsing, battling and coexisting, the two created a 1,500-year-long high civilization, both rising about 1900 BCE. The Babylonians finally captured and destroyed Ashur and Nineveh in 614 and 612 BCE, respectively. When Cyrus the Achaemenid invaded Babylon in 539 BCE, it ended in ignominy, just as the biblical prophets warned. Though they were adversaries throughout their history, it would be difficult to establish any substantial cultural or material contrast between Assyria and Babylonia. Despite the fact that Assyria's principal deity was Ashur, all-seeing, and Babylonia's was Marduk, son of the pure mound, elsewise the pantheons were nearly identical. Ceremonial gates, winged bulls, bas-reliefs, chariots, tools, utensils, jewelry, statues, and other artifacts made of every conceivable material that have been taken out of the mounds of Assyrian Babylon are among the prize exhibits of many of the world's museums. Thousands upon thousands of inscriptions in the cuneiform script, including cosmologic tales, epic poems, king's histories, temple records, commercial contracts, marriage and divorce records, astronomical tables, astrological forecasts, mathematical formulas, geographic lists, grammar and vocabulary school texts, and, not least, texts dealing with the names, genealogies, epithets, deeds, and powers of these kingdoms were the true treasures. Akkadian was the common language that linked Assyria and Babylonia, culturally, historically, and religiously. It was the earliest known Semitic language, predating even Hebrew, Aramaic, Phoenician, and Canaanite, but similar to them. However, neither the Assyrians nor the Babylonians claim to have originated the language or its script. Instead, many of their tablets included a postscript, indicating they were copies of previous originals. So who created the cuneiform script and language with its exact grammar and such extensive vocabulary? Who was the author of the previous originals? And why was the language known as Akkadian by the Assyrians and Babylonians? The book of Genesis is once again the center of attention. Babel, Erech, and Akkad were the beginnings of his reign. Could there have been such a thing? The remains of Mesopotamia have proven beyond a shadow of doubt that there was once upon a time a kingdom known as Akkad, founded by a much earlier ruler known as Shahrukun, righteous ruler. In his inscriptions, he claimed that his realm spanned from the lower sea, the Persian Gulf, to the upper sea, believed to be the Mediterranean, all thanks to the favor of his deity Enlil. He stated that he made more ships from numerous faraway lands at the dock of Akkad. Scholars were taken aback by the discovery of a Mesopotamian empire in the 3rd millennia BCE. Between the Assyrian Sargon of Du-Shahrukun and the Assyrian Sargon of Akkad, there existed a 2,000-year gap. Yet, long before the rise of Babylonian Assyria, the mounds dug up revealed literature, art, science, politics, commerce, and communications, a full-fledged civilization. Furthermore, it was clearly the forerunner and progenitor of the latter Mesopotamian civilizations. Assyria and Babylonia were simply branches off the Akkadian trunk. However, inscriptions detailing Sargon of Akkad's achievements and pedigree added to the enigma of such an early Mesopotamian civilization. They asserted his full title was King of Akkad, King of Kish, and that he had served as an advisor to the rulers of Kish before ascending to the throne. Was there perhaps an even earlier kingdom, Kish, that existed before Akkad? Experts wondered. The biblical verses received significance once more. And Cush begot Nimrod. He was first to be a hero in the land, and in the beginning of his kingdom, Babel and Erech and Akkad. Many scholars have speculated that Sargon of Akkad was the biblical Nimrod. If one reads Kish for Cush in the biblical verses above, it would seem Nimrod was indeed preceded by Kish, as claimed by Sargon. The scholars then began to accept literally the rest of his inscriptions. He defeated Uruk and tore down its wall. He was victorious in battle with the inhabitants of Ur. He defeated the entire territory from Lagash as far as the sea. Is the biblical Arak the same as Uruk mentioned in Sargon's inscriptions? That was discovered to be the case when the site now known as Varka was uncovered, and the Ur that Sargon was referring to was none other than the biblical Ur, Abraham's Mesopotamian birthplace. The archaeological discoveries not only confirmed the biblical accounts, but they also proved that there must have been kingdoms, cities, and civilizations in Mesopotamia before the 3rd millennia BCE. Only one question remained. How far back could one travel to identify the first civilized kingdom? The key that unlocked that conundrum was yet another language. Names held meaning not only in Hebrew and the Old Testament, but also throughout the ancient Near East, as scholars swiftly discovered. Every person and place name in Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian had a meaning, but the names of the rulers who came before Sargon of Akkad made little sense. Ur-Zababa was the name of a king whose court Sargon was counselor. Lugal-Zagizi was the name of the king who reigned in Erech, and so on. Sir Henry Rawlinson, speaking to the Royal Asiatic Society in 1853, noted that such names were neither Semitic nor Indo-European, and that they appeared to belong to no known group of languages or peoples. But if the names had meanings, what was the enigmatic language in which they were expressed? Scholars examined the Akkadian inscriptions once more. The Akkadian cuneiform script was essentially syllabic, with each sign representing a whole syllable, ab, ba, bat, etc. Despite this, the script used a lot of signs that weren't phonetic syllables, but meant God, city, country, life, exalted, or other things. The only explanation for this anomaly was that the signs were remnants of a previous writing system that used pictographs. As a result, Akkadian must have been preceded by a language that was using a writing system similar to Egyptian hieroglyphs. It was clear right away this was about an earlier language, not just an earlier style of writing. Scholars discovered that loanwords, words acquired in their whole from another language, were frequently used in Akkadian inscriptions and manuscripts, much the same way a modern Frenchman may borrow the English word weekend. This was especially true when dealing with the scientific or technical terms, as well as subjects involving the gods and the heavens.